Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of the second day. This is definitely my privilege and my great pleasure to be a moderator of a discussion of 4 distinguished scholars. I will try to introduce them briefly. I will do it in alphabetical order. Marie-Janine Calic is a professor for Southeast European history at the University of Munich, and she also works for different very important public institutions in Zagreb and in The Hague. And what I would really like to mention, she has published this year already 2 books, and it's only May, both in English translation. The first one, and you can see it here, and then you can also see it over there at the registration desk, is a history of Southeast Europe, and the other one is history of Yugoslavia. The next speaker will be Catherine Horel, research director of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, and so her main focus is on Central European history and especially Hungarian history, if I do understand it correctly, and she has published, among many other books, a book about Admiral Horthy, regent of Hungary, in French, and she is one of the co-authors of a very interesting book about those who were defeated in European wars of 19th and 20th century. Andrzej Nowak is a professor at the History Institute of the Polish Academy of Sciences and the History Institute of Jagiellonian University, and he also got a lot of important public positions in Poland, but also within European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, and among other things, he was for many years editor-in-chief of a very important magazine, Arcana, and his focus is Polish and East European history, history of international relations. He has published a few years ago a book about 1920, the first Western betrayal. And the last but not least, Andrejs Plakans is professor emeritus of European history at Iowa State University, and his books are about totalitarianism. His last book, I think, is Experiencing Totalitarianism, Invasion and Occupation of Latvia by the USSR and Nazi Germany, 1939-1991. So, so our task is to discuss, or better, your task, my task is to keep all of this within the given time framework, is to discuss cultural consequences of decisive historical changes Europe faced during the last century, World War I, World War II, Cold War, and its end, collapse of communist regimes in late 80s, the impact of violence, atrocities, material loss, change of statehood, of political regimes, and so on the formation, reconfiguration, loss, but also stability of culture and personal identity. As you could see from this brief introduction, I think, among other things, the advantage is that our panelists cover, in a geographic sense of word, different regions, different parts of Europe, Balkans, Central Europe, Baltic region, so they can use the empirical evidence from their own research in this different spatial framework. But we will start with the first 4 interventions. We made a deal that it will be like 10 minutes, and the focus will be on theoretical approach, models, narratives, the role of trauma, and so on. Yeah. So please, we will again start in alphabetical order. So please, Professor Calic, for their intervention.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to this important and very interesting conference. I will draw your attention now to a region in southeastern Europe, which is my topic of expertise, and in particular to the countries of the former Yugoslavia, where in recent years, and even before the violent breakdown of Yugoslavia, major reinterpretations and rewritings of history have taken place, have started. They are still underway, and many of them concern the history of the Second World War. One might argue that the history of the Second World War today serves as a projection surface for very current disputes over ideology and politics. The post-Yugoslav societies are divided, they are ethnically divided, the memories are ethnically divided, and memory politics as well. People often see the own nation only as victims of the others, where at the same time there's a striking culture of denial when it comes to crimes committed by representatives of the own nation. Serbian historian Dubravka Stojanovic has put it in the words that history was the continuation of war by other means. Each of the successor states cultivates at least one national historical trauma. In Croatia, the national, or should I say nationalist narrative centers around the fascist Ustasha state, which was established in 1941 by Hitler and Mussolini. This Ustasha state very often appears as the first independent state of the Croatian nation in modern history and a bulwark against the East. Consequently, the defeat of the Ustasha forces in 1945 by Tito's partisans have been labeled as a national tragedy, resulting in loss of independence of the Croatian nation. In fact, this independent state was not independent, but it was occupied territory by the German Wehrmacht and Mussolini's army. Today, there are many meanwhile, genocide against the Jews, Roma, and Serbs has been consequently downplayed or even totally denied. Today, there are many claims to rehabilitate not only history of the Ustasha, but even the Ustasha slogan, ready for the homeland, and to reintroduce it in the Croatian army officially, for instance, by the Croatian Church. In 2016, a plaque was unveiled with this slogan, ready for the homeland, to commemorate Ustasha fighters. The plaque was unveiled at the Jasenovac concentration camp, where at least 90,000 Jews, Serbs, and anti-fascists were murdered. The plaque was later removed after protests, but then removed to a location only 10 kilometers away from that place. Every year, thousands attend the commemoration of the so-called Bleiburg tragedy at Leubach Field in Austria, which commemorates the tens of thousands of Nazi-allied Croatian troops and civilians killed by Yugoslav partisans in 1945. Meanwhile, also in Serbia, rewriting of history and reinterpretation is underway. Chetnik leader Draža Mihailović was rehabilitated by a Serbian court in 2016. He had been found guilty in a trial after the Second World War for genocide against, in particular, Bosniaks, Muslims, and Croats, and then was executed, but now a court has rehabilitated him. The same was attempted for Milan Nedić, the head of the Serbian collaborationist regime, but this was turned down. Now, what does it mean today that the Second World War is still so prominent in public debates and is being reinterpreted by historians, intellectuals, and politicians. Historical reality offers an infinite amount of experiences and events out of which historical memory can select. What a society chooses tells us a lot about that society. First, it tells us about the search for new identities after the breakup of Yugoslavia and the breakdown of socialism. It is an attempt to replace the old socialist narrative of anti-fascist struggle by a narrative of national pride and victimization. Few topics are as emotionally laden as the number of people who had been murdered, tortured, and displaced, and the question of who was responsible for that. Such discourses can revive repressed feelings of powerlessness, mourning, bitterness, and anger in people who lost relatives during the war or heard about these crimes. However, it is really important what people and their forefathers had actually experienced. What counts is that interpretations of the past produce new perspectives of the present, which give people a new identity and generate political legitimacy for the new successor states. The bloody history of the Second World War, in particular the victimization narrative, produces image of collective persecution, suffering, and national self-defense. Propaganda has referred very often to the other side as Ustasha or Chetnik to revive traumatic experiences. This deliberately produces or enhances fears about the assumed other collective. In that, historical revisionism and stereotypes enhance ethnic differences and serve to justify an alternative model to multi-ethnic Yugoslavia, namely the ethnically exclusive national state. This is why the Croatian extreme right even attempts at erasing any memorialization of the partisan struggle and of anti-fascist victims. Instead, crimes committed by the partisans, mainly at the end of 1945, at the end of the war in 1945, are stressed, parallelizing them with those committed by Nazi-allied forces, namely Ustasha and Chetniks. This is an attempt at discrediting multi-ethnicity as such and the idea of brotherhood and unity for which the partisans fought a war and an ideology on which Yugoslavia was built. These new narrative symbols and languages used to describe history of the Second World War reshape historical consciousness according to new social conditions and political needs. But historical debates about the Second World War are also a metaphor for the Yugoslav wars of succession during the 1990s. They refer to debates of who was guilty for the destruction of Yugoslavia, which ethnic group committed most horrific crimes, and who had the highest number of victims. During these wars, a total of 3.5 million people were displaced just because they belonged to an unwanted population, which did not fit in an ethnically exclusive state, which was to replace multi-ethnic Yugoslavia. Last but not least, there's a strong tendency to cultivate what American psychiatrist Vamik Volkan coined as a chosen trauma. Chosen trauma refers to the shared mental representation of a massive trauma that the group suffered at the hand of the enemy. Such chosen traumas exist in all societies in the Balkans. For instance, in Serbia, the Kosovo battle in the 14th century is one of these chosen traumas. But more recent history serves too, namely the persecution of the Serbs by the Ustasha in the Second World War. In Croatia, we have the Bleiburg massacre committed by the partisans at the end of the Second World War and the so-called Homeland War, the Patriotic War from 1991, when Croatia became independent. And the Bosniaks have the chosen trauma when they speak about Srebrenica, mass crimes committed by Serb armed forces in 1995. These chosen traumas are used to justify all kinds of political demands, and they are used to refuse any normalization of relations with the other ethnic group, not to mention reconciliation. It is important to stress that chosen trauma functions as transmission over generations. In this case, historical truth is no longer important. What important is that members of the group are linked together through sharing the same trauma. In that way, the trauma becomes a source of identity building. It may serve as a legitimation of political elites in their respective goals. Chosen trauma also means that many keep the desire to avenge. This feeling of revenge is maybe dormant, but it can be easily mobilized and abused. In other words, the continued reference to trauma keeps a protracted vicious circle of ethnic hatred and revenge going. It's my deep conviction that at the end of the day, it is a question of decision for each society and for each individual whether to live in the past, perpetuating conflicts forever, or whether to restore broken relationships and anticipate a shared future. Thank you very much for your
Thank you very much for a very interesting speech about the role of historical narratives in formation of modern identity on the example of former Yugoslavia, but I'm sure we could find many more similar examples in recent European history, among other things, Czech and German narratives about common past and so on, so on. So thank you, and now the floor is for Professor Horel and her intervention, please.
Thank you, merci. Donc je vais profiter de ce confort qui me permet de parler français. Je vais vous dire tout de suite pourquoi j'ai choisi de parler français. D'abord parce que, n'étant pas spécialiste de la France, quand j'interviens généralement à l'étranger et c'est donc toujours moi qui dois parler une autre langue. Donc cette fois, je profite de la possibilité de parler ma langue maternelle, en plus dans ma propre université. Donc je crois que c'est suffisant comme explication. La troisième explication revient à ce qui a déjà été évoqué tout à l'heure quand on a parlé de diversité. Et puis, il y a quelqu'un qui a demandé si on lirait encore de la poésie bulgare dans 50 ans. Alors, je pense qu'on lira encore de la poésie française dans 50 ans, mais je trouve que quand on a l'occasion de ne pas se plier à l'usage de l'anglais, eh bien, il faut en profiter. Voilà, donc je vais tout de suite rebondir sur ce qui a été dit et ce matin et à l'instant par ma collègue, puisque on a évoqué ce matin la notion du tragique. Et c'est évidemment quelque chose qui est très présent dans les identités collectives de l'Europe centrale et orientale, mais ça appelle, je pense, un nombre supplémentaire de commentaires que ce qui a été dit ce matin. Et je vais me servir, donc, pour illustrer ce thème, du traumatisme en Hongrie du traité de Trianon. Donc, comme vous le savez tous, l'année prochaine sera la commémoration du centenaire. Et nous, les historiens, je dois dire, nous craignons le pire, puisqu'il est évident qu'il y a une utilisation, pour ne pas dire une instrumentalisation, de ce trauma, qui devient, comme il vient d'être dit, un chosen trauma, dans la politique de la Hongrie actuelle. Mais je vais d'abord faire mon travail d'historienne et revenir en quelques instants sur ce que ça a signifié et comment ce traumatisme est devenu justement un des fondements de l'identité collective en Hongrie. Alors, le président de séance a mentionné notre ouvrage collectif sur les défaites. Donc, s'il y en a qui sont intéressés et qui connaissent le français, voilà, je leur recommande notre ouvrage, dans lequel, justement, on s'est posé la question des traumatismes induits par les défaites, alors qu'elles soient des défaites dans des batailles rangées, ou des défaites qui sont perçues comme des défaites, disons, sur le tapis vert, des défaites où il n'y a pas eu de catastrophe militaire, mais la catastrophe vient après par les décisions que font les autres. Et là, j'introduis tout de suite une dimension extrêmement importante et qui n'a pas été évoquée ce matin, c'est la victimisation. Et c'est absolument nécessaire pour comprendre ce dont nous parlons en ce moment. Parce que pour justifier, pour expliquer le traumatisme, il est beaucoup plus facile, beaucoup plus confortable d'aller chercher les responsabilités au dehors ou bien de construire une responsabilité du dedans en accusant tel ou tel groupe d'avoir mené la nation à sa perte. Alors le groupe en question, ça peut être une classe, ça peut être un élément de la vie politique, mais ça peut être aussi un élément de la société qui est jugé comme un traître. Alors vous reconnaissez tout de suite dans ce que je dis la fameuse théorie non seulement du complot, mais de ce qu'on appelle le Dolchstoß, le coup de poignard dans le dos. Et c'est bien commode de chercher donc un bouc émissaire. Et on a ici dans la salle un théoricien du bouc émissaire, mon collègue hongrois Pokatila, qui a beaucoup réfléchi sur cette notion donc du bouc émissaire. Ça permet de se dédouaner de ses propres manquements, de ses propres responsabilités. Et en ce qui concerne l'histoire de la Hongrie, c'est une vieille tradition, c'est une constante qui remonte au débat déjà sur la défaite de Mohács au XVIe siècle. Et là, on rejoint aussi les traumatismes anciens, très anciens même, qui sont repris perpétuellement, qui sont exhumés, qui deviennent une partie de ce que l'on peut appeler en français, en mettant des guillemets, le roman national, ou tout du moins qui viennent prendre place dans le narratif de l'éternelle défaite, de l'éternelle victimisation. Et dans ce cas, chaque régime politique, en ce qui concerne la Hongrie notamment, va interpréter ces défaites, qui sont réelles, à son propre, en usant de ses propres catégories d'analyse politique. Et c'est extrêmement intéressant pour nous, historiens, de travailler sur ces questions et de voir quels sont les éléments des constantes qui restent dans la longue durée, chers aux historiens, et de voir quels sont les éléments nouveaux qui sont à chaque fois introduits comme des suppléments d'explication dans le narratif. Et le problème, bien entendu, se pose quand ces visions ou ces interprétations se contredisent complètement. Et là, on va avoir donc dans la société du pays en question une partie de la population qui va adopter tel canal interprétatif et une autre qui va choisir l'autre. Et ça permet d'entretenir une polarisation extrêmement importante dont le traité de Trianon est bien entendu un des exemples les plus significatifs. Donc, pour revenir à effectivement ce qui se passe au moment même de la signature du traité de Trianon, le 4 juin 1920, en fait, il ne se passe rien là, à ce moment-là. Il ne se passe plus rien. Ce qui amène le traité de Trianon, c'est bien entendu passé 2 ans auparavant avec la succession des chocs, en quelque sorte, que subit la Hongrie, chocs qui sont consécutifs à non seulement la défaite de l'Empire des Habsbourg pendant la Première Guerre mondiale, mais la consécutive destruction de l'Empire en question et donc les changements politiques qui secouent la Hongrie à ce moment-là, changements qui sont extrêmement profonds, puisqu'il y a quand même 2 révolutions et une contre-révolution, plus le traumatisme déjà du changement de nature de l'État, puisqu'on passe de l'État dualiste austro-hongrois à enfin finalement ce que les Hongrois voulaient quand même depuis très longtemps, c'est-à-dire une nation hongroise souveraine et indépendante. Le problème, c'est qu'elle s'inscrit maintenant dans un cadre territorial qui n'est pas du tout celui dans lequel on avait espéré qu'elle s'intègre, qu'elle se ferait. Donc il faut à la fois digérer, ce mot a été évoqué tout à l'heure, digérer les secousses politiques, il faut digérer la discontinuité territoriale qui intervient, avec tout ce que ça peut supposer pour les individus. Alors là, on peut être dans de l'histoire très, très personnelle. On peut être aussi dans la micro-histoire, puisque les frontières sont plus ou moins bien définies, mais elles vont bouger. Donc on va avoir des communautés villageoises territoriales qui vont pendant un certain temps ne pas savoir ce qu'elles vont devenir. Donc il y a comme ça des couches de chocs qui sont imposées au pays et qui créent donc un conflit d'identité extrêmement important. Et c'est là-dessus que je voudrais insister pour les 3 minutes qui me restent, à peu près. Je n'ai pas trop bien regardé l'heure, mais c'est bon. Pardon ? Ok. Donc, un problème d'identité, parce que on doit à la fois se réadapter à une structure étatique qui n'est plus du tout la même que la précédente, bien sûr, avec un très important changement de souveraineté, puisqu'il n'y a même plus de souverain, voilà, et se retrouver, se réinventer dans une communauté nationale qui devient homogène finalement, parce que les anciennes nationalités du royaume de Hongrie entrent dans les pays, sont dans les pays successeurs. Donc il y a là quelque chose qui est extrêmement difficile pour se réorienter. Et puis il y a ces changements politiques perpétuels où finalement on hésite encore sur la forme que va prendre l'État. Est-ce que c'est une république ? Est-ce que c'est potentiellement une république soviétique, bon, il y a quand même un moment de flottement. Et puis, on revient à la forme monarchique, et c'est seulement là qu'une partie de la population, finalement, s'y retrouve. Et la contre-révolution ne fonctionne que parce qu'elle revient à un cadre identitaire dans lequel les gens arrivent à se réadapter. Ça ne veut pas nécessairement dire qu'ils adhèrent au projet politique de la contre-révolution et au projet politique qui va être le régime orti, mais au moins ils savent de quoi on parle. Ils savent comment ça fonctionne. Parce qu'on voit revenir donc la forme monarchique. De toute façon, le souverain, c'était l'Autrichien, donc le souverain posait problème. Donc le fait de ne pas avoir de souverain titulaire de la couronne, c'est pas ça qui pose problème. Et en fait, la classe politique, finalement, c'est la même. Donc ça permet à la population de retomber sur ses pieds, de retomber dans quelque chose que finalement elle connaît et qui, pour le moment, ne lui pose pas problème. Et qu'est-ce qui va servir de ciment à cette nouvelle société qui est issue de la contre-révolution de 1919 ? C'est justement le révisionnisme. C'est-à-dire que c'est ça qui va devenir la base de l'idéologie, il y en a plein d'autres, mais je n'ai pas le temps de m'attarder là-dessus, qui va devenir une des bases de l'idéologie politique, c'est-à-dire éliminer le trauma potentiellement, le projet, c'est essayons d'éliminer le trauma en regagnant notre continuité territoriale du royaume de Hongrie et en effaçant la défaite, en effaçant le trauma. Sauf que, bien entendu, c'est beaucoup trop simple et ça ne fonctionnera pas. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this, I think, really very important item in this identity discourse, and so chosen trauma and trauma of Trianon, I think very important. I would even say very well cultivated trauma. I'm only not so sure that our Hungarian friends will be exactly celebrating the 100th anniversary of Trianon Treaty, as it was in the English translation, but that's okay. So, okay, let's move. We are not only moving in alphabetical order, but also from the south to the north. So after Balkans, Hungary, Poland. Professor Nowak.
Thank you so much for the invitation for this great occasion, both to the organizers, to the network of Solidarity and Memory, and also to the host of this place, of this wonderful old university. I'm coming from slightly younger university, not even 700 years old. And I'm stressing that because it is important that my university, Kraków University, was established to serve the union, or a union that comprised territories of today's Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, half of Latvia, and Poland. So 6 nations, if we take into this consideration also Jews that were expelled from Western Europe and lived there in that union established in 14th century for 4 centuries. So that union, so-called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, existed for 4 centuries between the end of 14th century and the end of 18th century. And it was partitioned, divided, just like Hungary was divided, I mean Hungarian Empire, in Trianon Treaty. That union was divided in the end of 18th century by 3 empires, and I am using quite consciously the word empires as important element of traumas connected with historical memories for that region. But we are, of course, dealing predominantly with the 20th century. But exactly this region that could be described historically as the region of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, of these 6 nations' historical experience, was called with a catchy word by Timothy Snyder, Yale University famous historian, the Bloodlands, the place where concentrated the most horrific experiences of civil population in Europe or probably anywhere in the world, at least in the middle of the 20th century. And that gives you, that can give you something like an illustration of that binary opposition set up by Professor Chantal Del Sol during the previous session. Between 1930 and 1950, more than 20 million people from that region, comprising once again Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland, were killed. Most of them, more than 13 million, were civilians. Among these 13 million civilians that were killed there between 1930 and 1950, 4.5 million were Jews living there. The rest of these 6 million Jews that were killed during World War II were living in other parts of Europe. But if we take into consideration 13 million civilians killed between 1930, beginning with dekulakization, collectivization led by Stalinist Soviet regime, then the Great Holodomor, or the Great Famine in Ukraine, then the Great Terror. Quite unexpectedly, I am sure that most of you don't know actually that the main culprit, the main victim of the Great Terror were not old Bolsheviks, were nationalities. People killed because they belonged to particular nationalities. Among 700,000 people shot in 1937 and 1938 in the Soviet Union, 300,000 were killed in so-called nationality operations. Just because people belong to wrong nationalities according to Stalin's selection. The biggest actually among that national operation was the so-called Polish operation, in which 150,000 Poles living in the Soviet Union were killed in 1937. Germans were the second in that list of eliminated nationalities in the Soviet Union. So that gives you another probably interesting perspective on difference of experiences in comparison with Western Europe. What happened in Western Europe in that time? Everything was okay, or was all right. Maybe several hundred people died until, of course, Spanish War, which was a horrible experience, but also concentrated only in Iberian Peninsula, and something that was learned and understood by Western, I would say, historical memories, unlike things that happen in eastern half of Europe. In the Bloodlands, I'm speaking about that particular region. And then comes World War II, where Jews were the main group of victims, but again, 3 million ethnic Poles were killed, predominantly by German Nazi occupants of that region in their anti-Slavic colonial imperial policy, along with several hundred thousands of Ukrainians and 2 million Belarusians lost their life during World War II. So again, huge losses. And I'm stressing all these losses that would be continued after the war. In 1945, for example, in Poland, a new gulag was established there by the Soviet liberators on one hand and new occupants. They established a system of camps that comprised something like 300,000 inmates. Roughly 40,000 people were killed after the war during the communist persecutions of the opposition in Poland. And of course, much bigger scale of repressions took place in Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, which would be, of course, I'm sure, continued by my distinguished colleague from Latvia. So again, experiences that make a kind of contrast to what yesterday Professor Overy said, that 1945 could be perceived as a kind of progressive, relatively progressive breakthrough in comparison at least with 1919. It was not that much so in the experience of these populations living in the Bloodlands territories. So going now to our problem, how to deal with these traumatic experiences, I would stress first that they were real. The losses were real and great. They were not invented. They were not created by some ideologians. Simply, most of the people living in these territories had huge personal losses. Some of them didn't leave mourning groups like Jews, because all of them, or almost all of them, were eliminated, or like Poles living in the Soviet Union. Exactly the proportions of the Holocaust happened to that nationality living within the Soviet Union before 1939. So there are no mourners of that group. But I am stressing the reality of this trauma because it contrasts with the fact that these traumas were not allowed, at least part of them, to be lived through, to be revealed in public. So there was something like a repressive erasure of traumas in that region after 1945. There were traumas that could be opened, like, for example, German Nazi crimes versus Poles or versus Ukrainians. That was something to be celebrated, to be, of course, critically celebrated, I mean. Unlike, let's say, Soviet regime communist crimes versus these populations, but also unlike crimes perpetrated by different nationalities and nations living them against each other. For example, Poles versus Ukrainians, Ukrainians versus Poles. This was something that could be called, with the terminology of Paul Connerton, really wonderful English scholar of memorial studies, something like prescriptive erasure, that is erasure of memory that serves reconciliation, that we shouldn't talk about, let's say, Polish-Ukrainian crimes perpetrated during World War II, because they just perpetrate our difficult relationships. But this doesn't work like that among those who survived and who have their victims in their families. They want something like a public acknowledgement of the fact that these crimes happened. And they didn't have any occasion for 50 years to live to that moment. And that's why after 1990 or after 1989, something like an eruption of frozen memories of frozen traumas happened in that region. And they clashed with something which makes really unpleasant and in a justified way, unpleasant reaction from the part of a kind of established perception of memory or politically correct memory that existed already in the West. Namely, they clashed with the concept that the only victim that should be memorized in public for Europe is the Holocaust. The Holocaust is obviously by far the most important crime. But what about these 9.5 million other civilians, non-Jewish civilians, that also perished between 1930 and 1950? Were their memorial groups, be it Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, or Poles, find themselves only in the context of the Holocaust problem, there is a kind of counter-reaction, very unhealthy, I would say, but quite understandable. And this situation, to go to the end, reminds me the theoretical framework proposed by Professor Adrian Pope during our yesterday's debates. Namely, he recollected three types of order in international relations: hegemonic, balance of power, and constitutional order. I believe that in memory it should not work like that. Nevertheless, I would compare what happened after 1991, and especially after the year 2000, when a group of countries from East Central Europe joined the EU, was a kind of a hegemonic constitutional memory order, was tried to be enforced on the new group of peoples joining from that region with their own different traumas. Two main or three main elements of this constitutional hegemonic vision of order were the Holocaust, colonialism, and expulsions. Expulsions with Germans as the only victims, which is again a complete misunderstanding of historical phenomenon of expulsions, because they were begun by Germans, by Hitler, with transferring Germans from the Baltic countries to Germany after Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and with the expulsion of Poles from Wielkopolska region, Silesia, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, I am going back to the main problem, namely to the problem of this, let's say, hegemonic constitutional order of memory proposed in Europe. So besides of the Holocaust, there is colonialism. And this is especially important to stress that East Central European countries completely do not share Western European historical experience in that respect. They didn't participate in colonial experiences of 9 Western European empires that established their colonies throughout early modern and 19th century history. Quite the contrary, they were really victims of colonial practices of either European empires like German Empire, Second Reich, like Russian, that is Romanov Empire, or then Bolshevik Empire, and by Habsburg Empire, and one extra-European empire that treated in a colonial way European, living in Europe, I mean, populations of Bulgarians, Serbs, and so on and so forth. And now they hear that they should share blame for colonial practices of French, Spanish, Belgian, German, English, Portuguese, and so on and so forth, older brethren in Western Europe. Again, a clash of different perspectives, a clash of different histories is really something to be noticed. So what is the possible way out from that comedy, or rather tragedy, of misunderstandings? I think the way out is not to be impatient, not to do anything from top down, but to listen each other and to let these traumas to be presented on an individual way that unites everyone. Everyone can understand individual trauma of a loss of your mother, of your son, of someone of your kin. And maybe culture is the best way to present that universal character of these traumas. I would give, as the final word, the example of the best dealing with these traumas, Symphony of Sorrowful Songs by Henryk Mikołaj Górecki, probably the single best example of a success in mass culture of a classical music. Symphony that is based on 3 songs of mothers deploring the loss of their sons. This is something that could unite Ukrainian, Polish, French, German, Jewish memories without establishing a hierarchy between them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think I can say that not only me, but all of us, we really agree with your conclusion. And I think especially the role of culture or art as a transnational phenomenon which can support the understanding and so on. Yeah, the other thing I would really like to mention is that you spoke also about, as you called it, frozen traumas or hidden narratives or something like that, which in fact was also the case of the previous cases. So in post-Second World War Yugoslavia, this Chetnik or Ustasha narratives, I think, were they maybe existed in exile and so on, but not officially, and also in communist Hungary, Trianon was not mentioned that much, and so on. So this is really a very interesting phenomenon, and maybe we will return to it in discussion. But before that, Professor Andrejs Plakans, please, very much for your intervention.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this meeting. I'm a newcomer to the Remembrance Project, and I hadn't thought much about it until I received the invitation to this conference, to this symposium. And at that moment, it wasn't quite apparent to me how anything I would say would really fit into the larger framework of this meeting. I had spent most of my professional life writing about the Baltic area from one perspective or another, but I was doing so as an American historian, as an American historian of the European social experience. So I wasn't quite a European, nor was I quite a Balt, since I had spent most of my life living in the United States. So what could I possibly contribute to a symposium about European memory, having now retired to the cornfields of Iowa and having now been asked to come to the metropolitan center of the world to comment on very large issues. The previous speaker, I think, gave me an opportunity to open with the following thought, namely that eventually the Remembrance Project is going to have to devise a model of intellectual inquiry that will indeed somehow incorporate the experiences of the large countries as well as the small European countries. I don't think that has happened yet, and there's some hope, however, that as these symposia continue, eventually that will take place. So this small country perspective, which I'm going to use, gives me an opportunity to structure my presentation as an interplay between the themes proposed by the Remembrance Project, including the one for this session, and the experiences of the historians and others, public intellectuals in the one country, the one Baltic country, which I know best of all, namely Latvia, where I started life before departing in 1944. So it'll be an interplay between large and small, large themes and small formulations of this, reformulations of the same themes, but something like this is going to, I think, eventually have to be involved in other symposia as well. Three comments, and that should exhaust what I have to say. The question of modeling. Perhaps it isn't being called that, but this three-part model of the 20th century, three-part proposition about the 20th century is a model. It is a mental model created for a purpose. And however, this is hardly an unprecedented activity, since modeling for social examination and analysis goes back into the 19th century, so there is no one is really a historian or social scientist is a stranger to this activity. So we're dealing here with a macro model, which would like to take the 20th century and all of its millions of different experiences and anchor these experiences in a three-part model in which the wars and then something less than a war in '89 played a key role. Latvian historians of a younger generation have been working for some 25 or more years now to develop a model of their own, of their national history, since they started from zero, having had to put aside the Soviet Marxist interpretations and develop something new. And for them, and here I must say that I have not asked them permission to speak in their behalf, but I do know their work. For them, a large model like this, the one proposed here, is perfectly acceptable because it does encapsulate a crucial dimension of Latvian life in the 20th century, namely, in the First World War period, the first threshold, the first appearance of a state of Latvia. In the second threshold experience, the Second World War, the disappearance of the state of Latvia, and in the third, the reappearance of a state of Latvia. So this three-part take on the 20th century is no stranger and perfectly acceptable, except that in the thinking of Latvian historians about their known national past, it is not the larger issues which the commemorative project is dealing with. It is really the national history which is being linked to these three crucial turning points. In that linkage, some of the features of these three thresholds come across very differently. In the first panel yesterday, for example, much was made of the fact that in the final analysis, the year 1919 was a pretty terrible year for various reasons, and so the panelists said. At the same time as those words were being spoken in this gathering, Latvian historians, several hundreds kilometers to the north, were celebrating 1919 as the year during which Latvia was liberated of foreign pseudo-armies that were occupying Rüdiger von der Goltz and Pavel Bermondavalov and Petr Stučka and the rest of them. So for them, 1919 is a pretty good year. It ended up with Latvian independence being consolidated in the hands of a Latvian government. Now, can both things be true? Can the larger characterization be true, and can the smaller characterization be true? Conceivably, they can, but as I said, this is an assignment, I think, for future symposia, because it wouldn't be very fair to simply suggest to Latvians that their take on 1919 or any other year should be pushed aside in order to have it replaced, in order for it to be replaced by some larger interpretation. However, the modeling process is good. I think that should continue, and I think it'll bear fruit down the road. Secondly, this is my second point, the model as proposed is, as macro models tend to be, an effort to freeze time, to hold time in place until the various components of which the model consists are examined in relation to each other. Fair enough, that's the way the intellect operates. However, I would suggest that in due course, a macro model that freezes time has to reintroduce into it the dimension of duration of events, because so much of what we have been asked to think about, in fact, are phenomena that have long duration. Even the concepts of severe violence, atrocities, and material loss, which are featured as the subject of this panel, are all things that happened in real time and over time. They did not happen over time, so this has to be reckoned into it. Moreover, the whole concept of impact as these losses and violence impact on cultural and individual identity the concept of impact itself is am I still okay? 2 minutes, yeah. The concept of impact itself is something that stretches out in real time. And in fact, if one looks at the history of diasporas, especially the Baltic diaspora, but others as well, one would find that the memory of these violent events can last in one form or another into the 4th generation. So the macro model has to introduce the element of duration. Third, and I think I'm going to make this very quick and end there, one of the former speakers in this morning's session suggested how important it is for people to have a state framework in order to have an identity. And in the case of the Latvians, this is particularly poignant because an adult Latvian who was born, say, in 1905 and lived to be age 90 would have experienced possibly 6 or 7 more collapses, renewals of state frameworks. It seems to me that this idea of the state has to be reintroduced into the model. The idea of a state framework and everything that it is useful for, including personal and collective identity, is something that will also have to be considered down the road. I had to have more to say about this, but I think I better quit at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Plakans, and I have to thank all panelists for their really perfect discipline and loyalty. I have asked Professor Kasekam to provide me with his papers of warning, 1 minute, 2 minutes, but I didn't need them at all. Thanks to you. So we have nice 25 minutes for discussion. And so I propose to do it as in the previous panel. Let's collect 3-4 questions. And then we'll try to, and please identify yourself because this is a panel about identities, please.
I have not a question, more a remark for Marie-Janine Calic and Andrzej Nowak. It's I'm coming back to the Balkan. I'm Johan Grunbauer from the Netherlands. Sorry, I have to introduce myself. Now you will understand my remark about Srebrenica. As you know, the Srebrenica is the fall of Bosnia. The perpetrators were the Serbians. And there are actually 3 parties. We have they are relevant to, that's the Serbians. We have the Serbians, the Bosnians, who were the victims, but also the Dutch, who failed to defend the enclave, the safe territory. And with my foundation, we are involved in this commemoration each year in The Hague, the 11th of July. And now we are involved in setting up a monument for this, what happened, this drama. And I think it's very good that such a monument must be seen and accepted by all the 3 of these parties. It's by the Serbians, by the Dutch, because the soldiers, a lot of Dutch soldiers committed suicide because they felt so guilty about it. And the Bosnians. And we are progressing well, and I think to accept this drama and to put in your life, to give it a place, that will be a good element. What do you think about it? Can you have some more remarks? to set up such an element. Thank you.
Thank you, and let's go on. So the gentleman here in the second row.
Thank you very much. Metodi Metodiev, New Bulgarian University. So I have introduced my identity, my affiliation. I have, again, my question is to Professor Nowak and Professor Calic. It's like the two presentations seem to be, in a way, interconnected. Probably this is why I'm also having the idea to ask both of you questions. So, to Professor Calic, my question is related to a kind of a scholar problem when we deal with trauma. And this is, you know, I have been educated in a good old-fashioned Anglo-Saxon way in which being neutral means being a scholar. But how can we escape the problem of divergence between us who are writing about trauma as something that has been as used as idea, something created, something constructed, and those who experienced it in a very different way? Because I'm afraid that there is the danger of, you know, us becoming this kind of elitist group of people and losing the majority, basically. And I think this is actually a bigger problem. And to Professor Nowak, shouldn't I really agree with your final proposal? But shouldn't we cure trauma with happiness? Because what you mentioned this is perfectly understandable. But should we try to choose other songs which would make us kind of happy, which made those people who lost their lives happy once?
Thank you. And now two other questions from that corner. So I would please you, and then in the next round. So please, you can.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Hans-Christian Jasch. I'm from Berlin. I'm heading the House of the Wannsee Conference. And from your two presentations again, Ms. Calic, Mr. Nowak, isn't one of the biggest challenges that while remembering, we often have to remember victims and perpetrators together, and that even this tripartite between victims, bystanders, and perpetrators doesn't work anymore. We know today that being a perpetrator or a bystander is often a situational question rather than anything else. So there are often even perpetrators in some cases can become helpers, yeah, and this is what they will say afterwards in order but especially looking at the Balkans, yeah, where the situation is so complicated historically, but you could say the same about Ukraine when you look at the Ukrainian national forces fighting for some time with the Germans, being involved in genocidal actions against Jews and Poles, but you also have the situation and afterwards the repercussions of the Aktion Vistula, where the Ukrainian population is resettled under very brutal circumstances. I wonder how we can ever accommodate this. This would be my question.
Please, last question for this round. Someone over there.
My name is Sergei Metlev. I work at the Estonian Institute of Historical Memory. During those two really interesting days, we were analyzing this slight difference between understandings of the 20th century history in Eastern Europe, or so to say, more Central Europe and Western Europe. And it's absolutely understandable that it is the focus, and we need to kind of understand each other better to make a better Europe. But I would like to also touch the topic of Russia, because there's a gap in this puzzle at the moment of our analysis. It's Russia, and the situation with the realizing what happened with their country are influencing us a lot, and especially those countries that have a huge diasporas of Russians on their territory. My thesis is that there is a huge mixture of contradictories. From one side, we have a country where you can visit in Moscow, the Museum of Gulag. They've made a lot of good research. From the other hand, some people are having the permission to promote Stalin and then have new monuments for Stalin in some cities. There's a situation where this country fought a war against Nazi Germany, and it was a necessary and important fight against this evil with the Western countries, but in the end of the day, the same country, Soviet Union, also occupied and destroyed independencies and lives of other citizens in other countries. And I would like to just ask for your analysis, if you would be in the position of a professional so-called secret advisor, how would you handle this issue to have Russia in the game of realizing the past of Europe? And in this way, hopefully, as a young person, I hope that it will help us in the future to prevent those mistakes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So we have collected 4 questions directed mainly on Professor Calic and Professor Nowak, but I think anyone can answer them. So maybe let's start with Professor Calic if you want.
I was maybe a bit unclear. I would like to stress that atrocities and crimes happened, and they are real, and the victims are real as well. But I object the notion that there is such a thing like a frozen trauma, which is like over 50 years or 70 years, in an iceberg, and then suddenly it... Why? Of course, there are continuities of ideas, of political concepts, of experiences, sometimes of actors. However, there are processes of transformation, and there are many discontinuities. And the major question is why certain societies choose in a certain moment the experience of crime or traumatic experience, and in others, they could also refer to totally contradictory experiences. The Balkans have a long history of reconciliation and peace, even after the most horrific wars. So this could also be a point of reference. So the question is, why do we choose exactly, the victimization discourse instead of the reconciliation discourse? For instance, Bulgaria and Greece, some of these arch enemies have found historical peace, like the French and the Germans. This is nothing alien to the region, or even the Serbs and Croats in certain moments. We have seen Greece and Northern Macedonia finding a compromise on a thing which everybody said this is so traumatic that never, ever, this dispute could be solved. So I do not buy in these eternal frozen traumas. I very much, and this maybe answers a couple of the questions, the concept of individual responsibility and guilt, and also individual responsibility. We should move away from the idea that the nation is a collective, and each and every Croatian is traumatized by the Bleiburg experience, or each and every Serb is traumatized through generations and centuries by what happened in the 14th century or so. This is simply not true, and not each and every Serb is guilty for Srebrenica, and not each and every, and so on and so forth. This is why I believe the individualization of the whole thing is very important, and it's even more important in society which are ethnically diverse, where the notion of collective guilt and collective idea of being victimized is like the seed for hatred and the next conflict. This is actually what I wanted to say. And yes, or I would plea for also the history of discontinuities. Look at the discontinuities and don't always look at this, apparently frozen conflict. Many things changed, and history is also these traumas are constantly being reinterpreted. It's not that, Trianon being interpreted in the 30s is the same thing like in the 50s or today. These interpretations always happen in a very concrete background of political and social conditions.
Thank you. If you want, Professor Horel, let's do it in that.
Oui, je vais reprendre la question de notre collègue sur les monuments. Parce que, comme vous le savez tous, les monuments parlent. Il y a je ne dis rien de nouveau à des gens qui sont des spécialistes des politiques mémorielles et de la mémoire en général. On a évidemment plusieurs cas de figure. On a le cas où il n'y a pas de monument et il y a une exigence de la société à avoir un élément qui permette de cristalliser la mémoire sous forme de monument commémoratif. Ça, c'est une chose. Et il peut y avoir effectivement des exigences locales à ériger un monument, mais on peut très bien avoir affaire à des monuments qui sont des falsifications, c'est-à-dire à des monuments qui délivrent un langage qui entreprend de donner une interprétation particulière à ce que l'on veut commémorer. Je vais citer l'exemple le plus fameux et le plus récent, c'est le monument à Budapest, le monument à l'occupation allemande, qui est une falsification pure et simple, donc, et qui sert de cache-misère en fait à la politique mémorielle actuelle qui est complètement biaisée. Donc le monument devient lui-même un objet d'étude pour nous, bien sûr, mais peut devenir un objet qui, au lieu de réconcilier, au lieu de donner un lieu dans l'espace qui permette de délivrer un message mémoriel qui soit apaisé, je ne dis pas consensuel, mais au moins apaisé, parfois c'est le contraire. Donc il y a aussi là un enjeu qui, je crois, nous parle à tous. Merci.
Thank you so much. I will begin shortly with maybe with a misunderstanding concerning this concept of frozen traumas. I didn't mean national level of frozen traumas, but nevertheless I would give you two examples of something that I believe existed as a kind of frozen trauma. I mean remembrance groups that coalesced around a specific experience of trauma, not on national level, but on a specific trauma level, like Srebrenica, for example, or a group of families of those who were killed there. I believe this trauma was not frozen because it was relatively quickly revealed, but I will give you two Polish examples. Katyń families. 27,000 officers were killed by the Soviets in 1940, but their families survived. So roughly more than 100,000 people lost their close people, relatives, and they were said in official propaganda that Germans did it. And this was a blatant lie that mobilized further this group to fight with whatever means possible for the revealing of truth. And it existed for 50 years, really. It was a frozen trauma, I mean frozen in that respect that it couldn't get access to the public. And only after 50 years, this task was realized. Another group which was in a conflict. So this shows exactly which you stress, and I agree completely with you. A multitude of very different perspectives on traumas within a national so-called unity. There is no such a thing as national unity in terms of traumas. There are different conflicting perspectives on different traumas. So-called Volhynia, a memorial group. Again, 100,000 roughly Poles were killed by Ukrainian nationalists during World War II. And most of their families survived in Poland. And they were not able to present their, so to speak, public grief on that loss of their relatives for 50 years. And what is interesting, a kind of rivalry between Katyń, a group of memory, and Volhynia, because Katyń was recognized quicker by the state after 1991, while Volhynia, due to this reconciliation concept with Ukraine, were somehow pushed aside. And this made a very interesting, though also difficult situation of a conflict between two trauma groups, frozen trauma groups, not on national level, but on individual level. Now, very quickly, how to, or maybe should we instead of singing sorrowful songs, introduce songs of happiness? Yes, I would be happy, but sorrow happens in real life. This is our human experience. We lose people, close people, even in natural, normal life. So there is nothing bad in sorrow. But of course, if we live only through sorrow, that is something wrong with us. That's obvious. So I think that the method to deal with traumas is to let these sorrows to be spoken, to be expressed. And the best way to do it in a way not offending others, but inviting others to share this common human experience is art. That's how I perceive it. So sorrow can interchange with happiness, but should not be seen as a kind of alternative. And the final point about Russian perspective. I believe when you mentioned Gulag Museum, it is interesting to see that it presents Gulag victims as only Russians. Whom victimized Stalin? Only Russians in that perspective that is allowed in Putin's Russia. And this is, of course, not true. Of course, Russians were the main victim. That's something obvious in the Stalinist regime. But they were not the only victim. They were also Ukrainians, Latvians, and so on and so forth. And another element of this narrative, that these losses were somehow justified by the necessity to prepare for the war. So there is something like a master narrative that unites this seemingly contrasting elements in Putin's Russia memorial perspective. So I would think that there are no prescriptions for Putin's Russia. Only Russians can find this way out of that, I would say, blockage of real experience and real memories connected with Soviet times.
Thank you. Would you like to, Professor Plakans, would you like to intervene in the moment?
About trauma?
About anything you would pick up from the questions.
Let me add one thought. As I think most of you know, trauma, excuse me, trauma started as a medical term, and eventually it has migrated into the social sciences. And I'm not altogether sure that it is being applied in the best possible way in every situation about collective entities. There is a vast social history, social science literature on traumas, on traumatizing contexts, on traumatic events and so forth. And much of this shows that not all people who are exposed to a traumatizing context end up being traumatized. So that when we talk about collective trauma, we are assuming, I think, we're using that term, trauma, about a group of people and suggesting that all of them in one way or another are subject to this psychological disturbance. I don't think that that is true in all cases. But in any case, it requires a lot of additional research to clarify why is it that some people's inner resources are so powerful and strong that they can, in fact, resist traumatizing situations and emerge eventually as still perfectly competent human beings, and while others collapse under those situations. I don't think the answers to those questions are fully available to us now.
Thank you. So we are almost running out of time, but I have promised at least 2 people that they will be able to ask their questions. So please, the gentleman behind you, I think, yeah, and then Professor Mazurkiewicz, and those will be 2 last questions of this panel.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Moderator, Professor Ivana Mentashashvili, Georgian National Museum, Georgia, Tbilisi. I want to address Professor Marie-Janine Galic. Yes, is it right? Have I pronounced it well, properly? Dear Professor, you have mentioned here that this approach imposes sort of shame or something like this on modern Spaniards, Portuguese, etc., for the colonial past, for instance. And is it proper, or maybe, in my opinion, it's groundless, that modern Portuguese or modern British or modern Spaniard, they must feel shame for instance, Warren Hastings, Vasco da Gama, or Bartolomeu Diaz and Hernán Cortés, and others who conquered, for instance, India or modern Brazil, New World. This was only one irreversible way of historical development. And can these people, are they able to suggest us something different, a sort of alternative? Why, for instance, modern Portuguese must feel something like shame for the activity of Bartolomeu Diaz or others, as I understood you?
Okay, thank you. And now the very last question.
Thanks.
Just the first question is concerning this frozen memory. And once I visited the university La Roche-sur-Yon en Vendée, and I was surprised by the story, the history of France, which were told by the students to me, and which was totally different from the books printed in Paris. And this really alive memory of being victims in France today. So this is not only the experience probably of Central Europe. Then concerning the misunderstanding between the West and the East, maybe one of the elements is the asymmetry concerning the approach to Marxism and Marx. In Central Europe, we removed the statues of Marx and Lenin because in our understanding, this is strictly linked with communist crimes. Recently, Jean-Claude Juncker celebrated the anniversary of Karl Marx and established a statute given by the Chinese Communist Party. So I think this is a different story. Maybe here is one of those elements of misunderstanding, the reasons.
Thank you. So again, anyone?
Actually, I believe the question was
Sorry, there was maybe a little misunderstanding. It was my suggestion that, not Professor Calic, that colonial past is coming back to those countries which created that past. I would give you example of what Portuguese did in Angola or in Mozambique in the second half of the 20th century. I think that's enough to give you answer why contemporary Portuguese should care really about their colonial past, because it's not that distant as to Vasco da Gama. It's really much closer. And I can give you a Polish example, because Poles also have something like a colonial past, connecting Poles and Ukrainians, or Polish landlords and Ukrainian peasants. It is sometimes, maybe wrongly, maybe rightly, interpreted as a colonial past. So I think, because it's relatively recent, it is something that should bother us, Poles, because there was a kind of justified perspective of victimhood on the part of Ukrainian peasant by Polish landlords in 19th century even. So I feel that's of course subjective. I feel this is close enough to feel us contemporary Poles responsible and to enter into a kind of dialogue on the shape of this responsibility. And I think all Western European post-colonial countries has something to do about that, because it's not about 16th century, it's about 20th century and late 19th century.
Anyone else? If not, allow me to thank all panelists, but also the audience for really very inspiring and interesting discussion. So thank you very much.